Hey guys, name's Dan Kaufman, as you know, and this is Grace Over Guilt. So this is a show for people who are in the process of rebuilding, not the people who have it all figured out and are here to tell you how. The people who tore something down on purpose or by accident, and are the people in the middle of putting something up new, and are trying to do it without lying to themselves the whole way through. So today is a story. Monday's always a story. So let me get right into this one. So here's something that I've carried into that building with me because last week we were talking a little bit about building. Um, so my knee's been talking to me for weeks. So a couple weeks ago, did something to my knee and just tweaked it while I was working out, prepping for a Spartan race, and something happened. So wasn't sure what. Went to a doctor, and the doctor gave that thing a name. So he's like, "Yeah, it kind of feels like an ACL tear." So and I had an ACL whatever you want to call it, reconstructed essentially about 28 years ago. So and made a lot of sense, right? So the knee's been rebuilt once. There's a reconstructed ACL in there. There's screws. And once that thing's rebuilt, you quietly start assuming forever that's the weak spot, and that's the place where the failure is going to come from. And it felt like that. Brought me back to that 3-on-3 basketball tournament where I tore that knee up. And quite frankly, that's just how your mind works, right? So you know where the seam is, so you brace for the seam. So I laid down in that machine to get an MRI earlier last week, with the story already written in my head. This is it. Rebuild finally failed 28 years later, gave out, and I was not wanting to find out what happened. I was waiting for the confirmation of what I had already decided had happened. So now here's the part that made it sting, and I mean really sting. So, um, while I was thinking about that, on July 11th, 2,000 miles away, roughly, right, in Utah. So I had a bunch of people from the Iron Council that were starting the Spartan Beast. If you don't know what that is, picture a mountain and picture a race up and around hills, 30 different obstacles designed by people who apparently want you to suffer and suffer hard because this is a half marathon. Obstacles, cold morning air that got really, really hot very quickly. That specific electricity only you can feel in the 60 seconds before the gun goes off. So I've been training for this. I've been planning for it. It was on my calendar. I had everything planned out, and I couldn't go. So, and the doctor's like, "Yeah, we don't know how bad it is. So unless you want to have risk more damage to your knee, don't go." So, and before the knee, I have to tell you about the weeks before any of this because this is really where the lesson rides and hides. None of this came out of nowhere. That's the whole thing. I have to be honest with. My body had been sending me memos for a couple weeks, a little stiffness before getting out of bed. I always had that, but it seemed to get worse. A twinge in the stairs, that I decided was nothing. Specific quality of ache that is different from soreness, the kind that does not warm up and go away, the kind that's trying to tell you that something's happening. And I felt all of it. And I'm not stupid. I've lived within this body obviously for a long time. So I filled every single one of those signals under the same heading. It's just a suggestion. It's not a verdict. It's just a suggestion. Something I would get through. Something I could push through for now and deal with it properly later when things slow down, which of course they never do because you're always the one who decides whether they slow down and you keep deciding no. So here's why we do that, why I did that. Because a suggestion is negotiable and a verdict isn't. As long as I called it a suggestion, I stayed in charge. I could push, I could override, I could just keep moving forward and keep the map exactly the way I drew it. The second I called it a verdict, I had to change plans. And changing plans just felt like failure. It felt like losing. So I lied to myself, and the body, being patient, being loyal, the way bodies are, kept turning the volume up one notch at a time, waiting for me to actually listen until finally it just stopped suggesting and started insisting. Insisting, and an insisting body writes its memos in language you cannot file under suggestion anymore. It writes them on a scan. I was at the point where I couldn't run, I couldn't squat, so it was tough. So this is the part that I don't want you to miss. The scan was not the moment the ground voted. The ground had been voting for weeks. The scan was just the moment I finally counted the ballots. So, to tell you a little bit, I alluded to it earlier about my knee. So I tore my ACL, the summer going into my freshman year of college. I was playing on a hot summer day. I can't remember if it was probably June or July on a 3-on-3 basketball tournament. Not a game that mattered, not a season on the line, a 3-on-3 tournament, which, I want to say out loud because it's spectacularly unglamorous way to lose a ligament. There's no scout in the stands. There's no story worth telling. It's just where a kid who planted wrong, going up for a jump shot and felt my little one part of my leg go one way and the other part go the other way. And they rebuilt it, and here's the interesting thing too is I did almost the exact same thing. I didn't listen to my body. I walked on it for at least a couple weeks, even with the swelling and everything and the pain. And before I did anything. And then they rebuilt it. And I finally dug in and said, "Yep, okay, we got to do something about this." That was roughly 28 years ago. And here's the wild thing: when I actually stopped and counted up, the reconstruction had outlasted a marriage, it outlasted a business I was dead certain would be the thing that defined my entire life. Has outlasted about 4 different versions of the guy that you're talking to, that's talking to you right now. So think about that for a second. The most reliable thing I own is a piece of surgical engineering for almost 3 decades, done on an 18-year-old kid who was far more interested in tournament than surgery. It was never once asked me for anything. It just showed up every single day, did its job, and let me pretend that reliability was free. And then a few weeks ago, the knee finally started to ask for that timeout and to stop. So results came back this past week, or actually, this week as I'm recording this. The ACL's fine. So the reconstruction held. 28 years in, the rebuild part is not the part that failed. When what I actually had was a few small tears in the meniscus, something else, the thing right next to it. I have to tell you, I sat there with sat a lot longer than I expected to because I had spent a solid week absolutely certain about something that I did not actually know. I had the diagnosis written, I had the whole narrative built, the rebuild failed. This is the moment the thing you were, proudest of finally came apart. The scan just looked at me and said, "Nope, it's something else." The map said the ACL, the ground said meniscus. And I want to be careful here because I'm not standing up telling you that this is good news and everybody clap. It's still a torn thing in my knee. It still cost me, going to Utah and running the Spartan race that I had trained for the last several months. The ground still said not yet, but the ground said something different than what I was braced for. And that gap between what I was certain of and what was actually true is the whole reason I wanted to, mention this today. So I've got to be honest with you about what happened in my head in that waiting room, because if I clean it up, I'm wasting your time. Every reflex that I've spent, 30 years building started screaming at me to override it. And these reflexes are loud, they're experienced, and they're really persuasive. They said, tape it up, brace it, take inflammatories, get on the plane, show up at the starting line, and deal with the consequences later. The reflex has a resume, right? So I'm not going to sit here and pretend it never worked. The reflex has gotten me through things that by all rights should have stopped me cold. Deadlines, losses, seasons, where the only thing that held the whole operation together was the guy who refused to sit down. I've built real things, but it's also the single most expensive habit I own. And I finally lived long enough to watch the invoices come due. Because here's the truth about borrowing against your body, against your peace, against your relationships, and against your future self. You can do it for a while. The bank will let you, but the interest is brutal and it always, always collects. Nobody skips the payment. You have to choose whether you pay it now on your terms or later on your body's terms. So for most of my life, I ran on one story about myself, and it was, for lack of a better term, a good story. The kind of story that sounded fantastic from the stage. It went like this: I show up no matter what, sick, tired, broke, heartbroken, doesn't matter. I always show up. And look, that story built things. I'm not knocking it entirely, but I want to read you the hidden clause, the part that nobody says out loud when they're up on that stage bragging about their work ethic. The hidden clause in "I show up no matter what" is this: the ground does not get a vote. It says the map is the truth and the terrain is just the obstacle between you and the map. It says your body is a subordinate, not a partner. It says the only honorable move in every situation forever is to push into anything, regardless. And I'm here to tell you, after living the whole thing, that story does not build things that last. It builds things that look incredibly impressive right up until the very last second that they fail. And they usually fail all at once. And they usually fail in public, and ask me how I know. So there's a news story and it's quieter and it's a lot harder to sell from the stage, which is probably why fewer people are selling it. The news story goes something like this: I build things that last, and things that last require knowing when the ground says no. Let me define my terms, because this is the hinge of the whole thing. The map is your plan, it's the drawing, and it can be a really, really nice drawing, color coded, milestones, timelines, the works. I mean, literally everything. But no matter how good it is, it's still just a drawing. The ground is the terrain that you're actually standing on. Your body, your bank account, your actual capacity on an actual Tuesday. It's real conditions. It's the real world. But and here's the difference between an amateur and the builder. When the map and the ground disagree, the amateur trusts the drawing and calls the terrain the problem. The amateur says the ground is wrong, but the builder reads the terrain and fixes the drawing. So the knee was the ground telling me that the map was wrong. Not forever, just not this, not now. And the entire test of who I have become over these last few years came down to whether I could hear that without turning it into a story about my worth. And now I know that some of you are thinking, because I thought it too, sitting right here, right there in that chair, that this is just a nice word for quitting. Because maintenance, just when we call it, we have gotten soft and we want permission to stop. And, you listen to David Goggins, you listen to Jocko, it's like, you power through, right? Doesn't freaking matter. And that question deserves a real answer, because the line between the two is pretty thin, but it does matter. So here's the difference, and it's the whole ball game. Quitting abandons the goal. Maintenance actually protects it. When I chose not to run that race, I didn't abandon the Spartan race or the training or the man who wants his knees strong at 70 years old. I protected all of it. I gave up one race to keep the next 20. It's not a white flag. I'm playing the long game. And the long game has never once looked impressive in the moment. It never gets the highlight reel. It just quietly wins while the impressive people who are busy blowing out their knees for applause. Quitting says the goal is not worth the cost. Maintenance says the goal is worth so much that I refuse to trade it for one moment of proving. And here's the tell: the way you actually know which one you are doing. Quitting feels like a relief. Maintenance feels like discipline. When I made that call, I didn't feel relieved. I felt a specific uncomfortable ache of wanting to go and choosing not to. That ache is exactly how I knew I hadn't quit. I had maintained. Relief and discipline live in two different rooms in your chest. And if you get quiet enough for one honest second, you can always tell which room you're standing in. So, as I mentioned, I didn't get on the plane. I sat with it. I made the call. I listened to my doctor. And I did the thing that the old version of me would have called quitting, that you're a loser. And the current version of me calls maintenance. I let everybody know that I was going to, that I was supposed to be running the race, that I wasn't going to be able to be there, send pictures, and they did. And they all did great. But I wasn't in it. And here's what I want you to hear. Both those things, got to be true at the same time. It was a great day, and I wasn't there. And I didn't have to pick one. A few years ago, I couldn't have done that. The not being there would have just absolutely wrecked me. I would have taken one MRI and turned it into a referendum on my entire character. See, you're slipping. You're a loser. See, the wheels are coming off. See, you're not who you used to be. This time, though, it was just information. The ground said not yet, and I listened. So that's the whole story, and that's also the entire point. Now, let me get off my own knee for a second and talk about yours, because everybody has one. Maybe it's not a knee. Maybe your map says grow your business, and your ground is a level of burnout you keep calling drive. Maybe your map says everything to everyone, and your ground is a marriage that has been quietly filling memos for a year that you keep filing under suggestion. Maybe your map says you're fine, and your ground is a doctor's appointment you have rescheduled 3 times because you just don't want to go, it's still a suggestion. So I want you to hear the pattern because it's always the same pattern no matter what. There's a plan you're trying to be loyal to, a drawing that you're really, really damn proud of, and there's a piece of real terrain that has been trying to get a word in for quite a while. Sometimes just a couple weeks, but sometimes it could be a year or years. And you've been calling its vote suggestions so that you get to stay in charge of the map. So here's the hard truth that I had to swallow in that waiting room as I was, as I was going through these results, waiting for these results. The ground is going to get its vote either way. That's not up to you. The only thing up to you is whether you count the ballots early while it's still a suggestion and the fix is cheap, or whether you wait until it's a verdict and the fix is a surgery, a divorce, a diagnosis, a business that you have to bury. The ground always wins the long game, always. So the only variable is how much it costs when you actually finally admit it. So go find that memo, the one that you've been filing under suggestion, and read it like a verdict for one honest minute. The minute is cheaper than everything else that comes after you keep ignoring it. So now I want to bring back the knee around one more time because I've been sitting with this all week, and I think it's the realest thing that I've got for you today. So the reconstruction has lasted 28 years for a reason. And it's not because I pushed it. It's because somebody rebuilt it right back when I was, 18, 19 years old and far more interested in the tournament than the surgery. And then mostly I did not do anything stupid to it. It got maintained quietly on the boring days. Was I perfect? Hell no. But I still maintained. When no one else was watching and skipping the maintenance, it could have gone completely unnoticed. And that's why when the scan finally came back, the rebuilt part is the part that held. I need you to hear that because I almost missed it. I went in there braced for the seam to fail, and I was certain that the weak spot was the place that had already been broken once, and it wasn't. The place that had already been broken once, then rebuilt right, then quietly maintained for 28 years was the strongest thing in the picture. And when I look at the things in my life that had actually lasted, that is the pattern every single time. It's never the thing I white knuckled through in a blaze of glory. It's the thing that got built right and then maintained in the dark on the boring days, on those Tuesdays when there's no applause available and nobody would have known if I let it slide. So that knee is not the exception to the rebuild, that I'm in the middle of. It's the whole thesis of it. Walking around on 2 legs, reminding me every time I take a step that the thing you rebuilt honestly is not your weak spot. It might be the only part of you that's not. And reminding me that lasting and grinding were never the same word. I just couldn't tell you the difference until the ground made me stop long enough to feel it. So here's where I want to leave you today. You don't have to prove the map by drawing it better. You can spend your whole life making it a more beautiful plan and never once, test it against real ground. You prove the map by walking it and moving through it. And every so often when you actually walk it, the ground tells you that the drawing's wrong and the map's wrong. So the only question that actually matters is whether you can hear that without calling yourself a failure. Whether you can take that time out as information instead of an indictment, whether you can let it be a great day that you were not in. The ground gets a vote. It always does. The strong move, the move that builds something lasts, is finally letting it cast one. So if you know somebody that's grinding through an injury that they should be healing, and you know exactly who I mean, some of you just pictured their face, do me a favor, send them this episode and tell them the ground gets a vote too. So my name's Dan Kaufman. This is Grace Over Guilt. I'll see you Wednesday when we talk about the cost of the dream in the invoice nobody ever bothers to add up. Nothing to prove, nothing to hide. Take care of the ground that you're standing on.